start with this, Milton. We are obviously dealing with this global pandemic. It affects, it's the classic, I mean, there's a lot of lessons in it on so many levels, but it affects and threatens everybody in the globe and then each in their own particulars. And I would like you to talk very specifically. We speak in general terms, and we've spoken in general terms about how the World Bank, IMF, financial systems backed by the US dollar, I think ultimately backed, as Daniel Bester would talk about, by nuclear bombs, by like the actual power in military terms, but of the United States, that the World Bank and IMF kept on the colonial agenda in Africa of basically just making it, underdeveloped, safe for capital, international capital. Specifically, as we're in the pandemic age, what to this day has the World Bank and IMF structural adjustment packages and financial mandates that still are active in the continent today and, of course, across the world? What have they done, along with anything else, local mistakes, mismanagement, foreign direct investment, to Africa's health systems?
Right. Well, okay, there's so many levels. So I'll touch upon a few and then we can revisit it. If I missed out some points, just prompt me along. But this is how I would start. Look at the difference between African countries and Cuba. Just think about that. Ponder that for a little bit. How is it that a tiny country like Cuba is always going to the rescue of Africa, a continent of 1.3 billion people today? Think about that. 54 countries with all these presidents, vast natural resources. But when Ebola struck, guess who it was that went to Africa's rescue? It was Cuba. Cuba sent hundreds of doctors, hundreds of healthcare workers. Cuba bailed out African countries because African countries are so disjointed that they could not even coordinate a plan and say, we can do this by ourselves. We have 54 countries with 54 national armies. And I point out the armies because the militaries are normally the best financed and equipped organizations in African countries. Forget it, not teachers, not doctors, not hospitals, but the military. But they couldn't even say, let's deploy our military to the 3 West African countries that are most struck by Ebola. They couldn't do that. Why? Because their military are so busy suppressing, repressing, and torturing their own citizens. They don't have the mindset that it would take to go and help other Africans in distress. So it took tiny Cuba to control and eradicate Ebola in Africa. Let me give you a second example. Cuba had to deploy thousands of soldiers and lost as many as 10,000 Cuban soldiers in order to liberate Southern Africa. Had it not been for Cuban soldiers and Cuban equipment, and because Castro was actually the commander-in-chief who was actually directing the battle from Cuba. UNITA would have ended up being in power in Angola. And UNITA, of course, was a CIA-funded and a South African-funded reactionary organization, which means Namibia would not have been liberated when it was, which means South Africa would have been liberated much, much later. And who knows, Nelson Mandela might have died in prison because it took Cuba to defeat South Africa's army at the Battle of Quito Cuanavao in Angola in 1987-88 for South Africa to realize that it could actually be defeated militarily. And it withdrew from Angola, and it withdrew from Namibia. And it went back home, and 2 years later, Nelson Mandela was released. It was not because of a change of heart. It was because of the defeat they suffered at the hands of Cuba. They realized that Cuba could actually, in coordination with other African countries, invade South Africa itself and affect a military solution to end apartheid in South Africa, which, by the way, there are many people who say might not have been a bad solution, because more than a quarter century after the defeat of formal apartheid, all the structures of economic apartheid still exist in South Africa. So that the white minority, less than 8%, controls more than 72% of the land. But that's another story altogether. Mm-hmm. And I bring all this to say that because the World Bank model is the anti-Cuba model. So African countries have not been able to do anything that Cuba has been able to accomplish, even with its limited resources, because the World Bank model of neoliberalism would not comport with that. In order to access World Bank financing, as you know, there are what they call conditionalities. And part of the conditionalities include you cannot subsidize local industries, which in fact, everybody that knows any history knows that every country that industrialized was because of a partnership between the state and the private sector. There's no country that industrialized on its own. Britain plundered from the rest of the world and was able to use that accumulated capital to industrialize. And then after the Industrial Revolution in Britain, it spread to other parts of the world, including parts of Western Europe and the United States. In the United States, of course, we know the capital accumulated by enslaved labor of Africans enabled the US to industrialize. And that's what you call a partnership of the state and private sector.
Yeah, you're great. So Milton, just keep going. You were talking about South Korea and how development happens. So you're on fire. Just keep going. Okay.
Okay, good. And then I said, for example, we see the United States is always arguing with China, right? Now, are those private entities arguing? No, of course not. It's the United States government arguing with the Chinese government, because the US is the number one guarantor of private enterprise in the United States. And the same thing for China in China. So all this World Bank nonsense going around the world, preaching to weak African countries, that you need to allow private enterprise to take the leading role. It is absolute nonsense. It would not survive in the United States. It would not survive anywhere else in the industrialized world. So why is that being preached to African countries? That's because of their position of weakness. All right, so that's in terms of industrialization. Then the other aspect is privatization, right? So you privatize the utilities, and what's going to happen? It's going to go into the hands of some Western investors and their corrupt African elite in African countries. So now you have the utilities monopolized. And as you know, the fees are going to be increased. So the people that are already being squeezed are going to be further squeezed, because now the utilities are not subsidized by the state. They're in the hands of private enterprise. Now, let me go to the other point that you actually implied in your question, the healthcare system and the education system. Look at Cuba. Look at what Cuba has been able to accomplish with education in Cuba. Not only has it lifted the consciousness of Cubans, meaning they know their world, they know their position rather, in the globe, and they know their history, but they know how to manage their affairs with the limited resources that Cuba has. Look what education has done to China. Before the Chinese Revolution, literacy was around maybe 20%. Today, it's like 97%. And that is how China has been able to modernize and build a modern industrialized society. Look, not many people are aware, and few might not even believe this, but in 1959, the per capita income of Ghana was double that of China, believe it or not. But what has happened in the interim period? China, of course, kicked out all the Western countries that were exploiting their resources, applying dope to China, and took control of its resources and its political affairs. Now, anybody can say whatever they want about the Chinese political system. Yes, we can debate that, but nobody can deny that China has transformed itself from a backward, rural, peasant society into a country that is today a superpower. And Africa has perhaps much more resources than China does. But what Africa lacks is the political structure that would allow it to set its own political and its own economic agenda. And that makes a vast difference. Anybody can say whatever they want about the United States system, but at least the people that are elected to manage the affairs of this country, their number one concern is the United States, often to the detriment to the rest of the world. And in terms of the elite that actually govern, often to the detriment.
I think how they're defining United States is very, 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 very narrow. And I actually do think.
I was going to add. I was going to add that often to the detriment of the majority of the citizens of the United States.
Right.
You see?
Right. So,
but what we have in Africa are people who literally are elitists, so long as their own narrow interests are satisfied, they have total disregard for the rest of the population. And there's a book that I always talk about when I ever get on programs like this, and it's Nkrumah's Neo-Colonialism, the last stage of imperialism. And what I like about this book is if people don't have time to read the entire 200 plus pages, the introduction alone, which is about 12 pages, really summarizes his thesis brilliantly. And he says, think about this. If the individual governments in African countries don't owe their positions in power to the domestic constituency, to the voters, why should they care? Think about that. If all you need to do is satisfy the needs of a former colonial power, like Britain or France, or the new superpower, the United States became the new superpower in Africa in the 1960s, after it became clear that the former colonial powers had run out of money. Britain was bankrupt, France was bankrupt. That was the era of the US ascendancy. But nonetheless, his bigger point is this. If you are dependent on those outside powers for your regime, why should you care about the needs of your citizens? That question, when he posed that question, when he wrote the book in 1965, is still relevant today in the 21st century. So for example, a country like Uganda, why should General Museveni care about what Ugandans think about him when he knows that all he has to do is do a few things? Open up the industries, open up the resources to Western companies, Britain, United States, deploy Ugandan soldiers to Somalia and tell the United States that, yes, you are afraid of Al-Shabaab, you're afraid they're linked with Al-Qaeda, you're afraid eventually they'll become powerful enough to strike at continental US. I will do the police work for you. I will deploy Ugandan soldiers there. Right. If a person like Museveni presents a deal like that to the US, think about that. He can be in power for as long as he wants. And that's why he's been in power in Uganda for 34 years. Well, the schools have collapsed, the hospitals have collapsed, the roads have collapsed, and you have this being done while the World Bank is condoning this kind of activity and continuing to lend money to countries like Uganda. It's a nightmare scenario. And I think the only way it can actually end is if the youth of Africa do away not only with the current leadership in Africa, but the entire structure of how government is managed in Africa and how they manage their affairs and the economy vis-a-vis the rest of the industrialized world.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.